crisis, I thought it would make sense to talk a little bit about my favourite book on crisis, right? Which is a brilliant book in the 1970s, which some of you might have read, and some of you might have never heard of in your lives, called Policing the Crisis. And even though it's called Policing the Crisis, it's not just about the cops. It's about something that a guy called Stuart Hall, who wrote it with a load of his colleagues, calls a moral panic. And a moral panic is kind of self-explanatory, right? It's when people start to panic about morality, right? The morality of society, right? Are we going into moral decline? Are we losing touch with our moral ethic and our moral values and our moral traditions? Are there changes that need to happen in our society to stop this drift or these changes? And how can we go about doing that? And in the 70s, Stuart Hall is thinking, yeah, this is people going crazy about morality in Britain at the moment. And the reason that the media and the politicians and the police are saying that that we need to be concerned about the morality of society is because they're saying there's a big crime wave. And that crime wave they refer to as mugging, right? You've all heard this word mugging before, right? And they say that mugging has arisen in the urban areas of Birmingham, Manchester, Bristol, London, and it has arisen because there has been a wave of new people coming to Britain, and that wave of new people has brought this new kind of crime and moral decline. But when Stuart Hall looks around Britain, he actually says, is that really the crisis that this country's in? In the 1970s, there's an economic crisis, right, which is affecting people's work, their livelihoods, maybe their pensions, their ability to get a job and to keep a job, to be paid a decent wage. And what he realises is that, actually, these are the real problems facing people, right? Whether they can get a job and find secure housing and access the services that they need. But the government doesn't seem up to dealing with that crisis. Either they're not able to, or they're not willing to. And if they're not able to deal with the crisis that people are really facing in their everyday lives, then they're going to start to lose legitimacy. They might get voted out of power. Right? People might rebel. Right? They might resist. They might even overthrow them. And so, in order for them to regain their legitimacy in the eyes of the electorate of ordinary people, they say, look, don't worry about this crisis in the economy that's affecting your job and your wages and your housing and your pensions and the services you're trying to access. The real crisis that we're facing is a crisis of morality. It's a crisis of law and order. And so instead, they introduce massive increases in policing, in stops and searches, in imprisonment, in arrests, in forms of police weaponry, and they say it works, right? Policing and crime becomes top of the agenda, or very high up in the agenda of people, and this is the real concern that they're dealing with. And I think it's a useful book, even though it was written all the way back in the 1970s, because I guess we're kind of living through a bit of a moral panic today. There isn't just one crisis, of course, right? There are multiple, as Anna said, crises, right? We've got a cost of living crisis that we're all aware of, right? Affecting our jobs, our incomes. There's a housing crisis, particularly in cities like London, right? Where a generation of young people are either going to have to rent, or if they are able to access more secure housing, will probably be moving out to the distant suburbs, right? And having to pay an arm and a leg to commute into the city in order to get to work. There's a social care crisis and a healthcare crisis in our NHS, right? Brought into sharp relief by the pandemic. And I mean, yeah, the pensions crisis, I mean, especially for people our age, I mean, pensions are just a myth, like, we're just going to work till we die, right? And of course, there's a mental health crisis, right? We know this, that there's a crisis of people who are struggling with their mental health and aren't able to access the kind of services that they need in order to regain their mental well-being. And of course, there's a crisis at our borders, right? People are dying in the Mediterranean and in the Channel. They're dying and suffering in detention centres and on floating prisons. There's a lot of crises happening, right? And a lot of those crises, we can be said, are leading to people suffering and in many cases dying. But the moral crisis that the government says we're facing is a kind of different one. And I think they blame the crisis that we're facing on a lot of things and people, but I think I wanted to focus on one set of people that the government is currently focusing, and that's young people. The government is concerned that the real moral crisis that we're facing is a crisis in our youth. And I think there's two ways in which they kind of frame it. They're kind of contradictory, but they both kind of serve a similar end for the government. So the first thing the government say is, look, there is a crisis, there's a moral crisis in our youth because there is a moral decline. We've got serious youth violence, we've got gangs, we've got knife crime, we've got young people being groomed for terrorism. We've got young people who are involved in criminality. We've got young people doing immoral things on social media and what have you. If these are the problems that we have within our society, this is our moral panic. Right? We are in panic about this. And what's our solution? It's more police, bringing more police into our schools and to our colleges and our university campuses. It's more police powers to stop, to search, to arrest, to apprehend, right? The new crime sentencing and court bills is making it illegal for a member of the public to challenge a stop and search when they see it taking place and they think is unlawful or discriminatory. They have to increase surveillance, particularly of our young people, so they can monitor our digital communications, increase CCTV, increase the use of biometric data, like our iris scans, our facial recognition scans, which they're trialling at Notting Hill Carnival, the taking of fingerprints, which they're trialling in shopping centres in places like Manchester and Leeds, right? So they're massively increasing police power, but they're also increasing prison power, right? Since the 1990s, the prison population in Britain has almost doubled. The women's prison population has more than doubled. Right? And they're expanding the power of prisons to incarcerate more and more people, right? And they're saying this is because of moral decline in society, right? Proliferation of violence. But there's a flip side, because they're also saying, gee, these young people, they're too moral. They're also up on their morality. They think they're more moral than us, the elders, right? But they don't call it morals, do they? They call it woke. And they say, oh, these young people, they think they're more moral than us. They're tearing down statutes, right? They're demanding changes to their curriculum. They're trying to say that our curriculums are immoral, right? Because they don't talk about Britain's imperial history. They don't talk about Britain's multicultural politics and society and arts and cultures. They don't think about the, politics or history or literature or geography in the global context that makes cities like London what it is today. They're saying that we're immoral. These young people are too woke. They want to formulate their own identities when it comes to sexuality or gender or ethnicity or nationality, rather than the prescribed identities which we say that they can fit into, and the boxes that we say they can tick. How dare they say that they're more moral than us? We better get into those schools and make sure those curriculums stay as they should be, wedded to tradition. We better regulate those universities and make sure that these students who think they're more moral than us with their so-called wokeness aren't disrupting our traditional British values and our commitments to what we consider to be free speech. So young people for the government are at the same time symbols of the moral decline of society through their apparent commitments to violence and harm and whatever it might be, but also symbols of a too moral society that is taking morality too far, which also requires regulation. And apparently the government are sitting in the happy medium, just right in terms of their morality. But of course we know, right, that the government are wholly wrong on this. And that the reason that there are problems with serious youth violence and social disaffection isn't because of the moral decline of young people. It's because of the other crises we're facing. The crisis of mental health, the crisis in housing, the crisis of the cost of living, the crisis in our care system, right? If our young people had access to decent jobs and employment, had access to the mental health provision they needed, had access to secure housing, had access to all the things that they need in relation to accessing education, there wouldn't be any need for them to be on the roads, right? There wouldn't be any need for them to access income generation through ways that are criminalised or harmful, right? We know these things already. And we also, of course, know that what gets disregarded as being woke, or too moral, or posturing, right? Is actually the new progressive politics, right? It's a progressive politics which is saying, actually, we need to identify in the ways that we choose to. Actually, we do need to learn about histories which go beyond the Tudors and the Victorian and the other English, British monarchs. We need to have the politics and the histories that represent us and our histories, but also crucially help us to understand the kind of futures that we need to build as well. And I think it's therefore we should be unsurprised that young people are leading these struggles for rethinking and re-understanding what constitutes mental health and mental well-being. They're leading the campaigns for climate justice and demanding a more equitable future. They're leading the struggles for liberating our places of learning, right? Whether it be formal places like our colleges and universities, but also informal spaces, right? Whether they be on digital platforms or in our communities. And so, while we're facing multiple crises today, I think we're also facing have in front of us multiple opportunities of resistance and hope. And I hope those are the kind of things that we're going to be exploring today over the next couple of days, and lead us to not simply feeling down in the dumps about all the terrible crises that we have, but also the many opportunities there are as well. Thank you very much.
I'm going to be talking to you about the climate crisis and the broader planetary crisis that it reflects, and I'm not sure where we go in relation to it, except precisely that we do need to do stuff, and yes, young people are at the forefront of doing what needs to be done in terms of addressing catastrophic climate change, and I think more is still needed. And one of the things that I want to sort of just highlight in these opening remarks here is that the ways in which we think about climate change and what causes climate change and how we deal with its consequences is something that it actually does matter how we think about it and how we understand its emergence. And specifically what I want to talk about is that it's often understood in terms that it's an outcome of excessive processes of capital production, and capitalism is something that's, or is the process that is responsible for climate change. But if climate change is linked only to capitalism, then often when we think about what might be some of the solutions to capitalism, the things that get put forward occur within that frame. They align with capitalist imperatives, so things like carbon trading or outsourcing of carbon-intensive processes from the north to the south. Or then we think that if industrialization could be state-controlled and organized along socialist lines, then the climate crisis could be solved through forms of eco-socialism. But social democratic politics in the West have been based on the idea that economic growth is necessary for redistribution. And so it fails to think about the ways in which colonial extraction has been vital for the building up of the money that's been available in the West for that redistribution. And so it doesn't address the ways in which colonialism has both generated the inequalities that are central to the climate crisis, both in terms of its cause, but also the differentiated nature of its consequences. The other thing that I'd like us also to consider is the fact that the climate crisis that we're currently facing, as serious as it is not the first time that human beings have faced the destruction of their worlds. The modern world, as we currently live in it, is based on the historic destruction of the worlds of others, usually termed indigenous peoples. So this then poses the question of what it means to accept as necessary the achievements of economic growth that have been at the expense of the impoverishment and displacement of others. Like, why are we so concerned to save our world and not reflecting on the fact that our world is based on the destruction of the worlds of others? Perhaps there's something more that we need to think about than simply what it would mean to continue as normal. So not recognising the patterns of political economic development that have produced the global inequalities associated with climate change in the present undermines the possibility, I would suggest, of working out an effective way of addressing and dealing with climate change. So there was a piece that came out recently by Jason Hickel. You may know him, he's sort of written a lot around these topics, and one of the things that caught my attention was the fact that he looked at countries' historical responsibility for carbon emissions, and he looked at it from based on their territorial emissions from 1850 to 1969, and then consumption-based patterns from 1970 to 2015. And adjusting for scale and population, what his research uncovered is that if we assume initially that the atmosphere is a shared and finite resource and that all people are entitled to an equal share of it, then what he was looking for was the extent to which nations have exceeded or overshot their fair share of a safe global emissions budget. And what his analysis indicated was that formerly colonising countries, those that he calls the global north, are responsible for over 90% of excess emissions. So they're not responsible for 90% of emissions, but 90% of excess emissions. And I would suggest that because this is an analysis that takes place over 200 years, during that time, many of the countries that are now seen as independent nations were actually colonised by those other countries, and so didn't have the ability to make their own decisions at that time. And so if we included their total in what we attributing to nations in the present, then that share would increase even more significantly. So whilst a lot of current debates around climate change focus on China and India, if we're looking historically at who has produced the excess global emissions that have contributed to climate change, then what we see is that over 90%, and I would suggest probably over 95% of those excess emissions are being produced by the West. This opens up the question of what is an equitable response to this, given that we are all at the effect of catastrophic climate change. The issue is partly that those who've contributed to the most to it are the least exposed to its worst effects. So if you think about the places that have been, until quite recently, so now we're beginning to see fires and floods within Europe, the US and Australia, but until very recently, if we're thinking about these sorts of severe catastrophic climate events, they were often in places like Bangladesh or Pakistan, we saw recently the floods, or in Madagascar, and then places that haven't actually produced or contributed to the production. So, but it's really difficult to persuade richer countries, former colonising countries, to accept their fair share of, or to accept that they are historically responsible and to do something. And to the extent that there is an argument for them to do something, the arguments are often, how do we mitigate or adapt in order to live with the changes that we've made? Or then there are things like, as I was mentioning earlier, things like carbon reductions in the north at the expense of shifting carbon-intensive processes to the south, or even the fact of if we're wanting to shift to cleaner fuels in the global north, what are we doing? We're outsourcing the production of biofuels to farmers in the global south who are no longer producing crops for subsistence, but are now producing cash crops for sale to Western markets and so on. So there's an issue of food security of farmers in the south. Or then the push towards electric vehicles. Well, where is the cobalt and lithium mined that is vital for the production of these electric cars? So the shift from diesel and petrol to electric, as important as it might be, doesn't actually resolve Summer has argued, colonialism actually began with renewables. So it was wind power that took the ships to the east, and solar power that grew the cotton and the opium that were key colonial commodities. So the association, so his argument is effectively that we need to think about what the energy is used for, and not just what the source of the energy is, if we really want to address the imbalance that is being produced through colonialism, and that colonialism isn't actually over. We might call it capitalism, and we might now be wishing for a shift to green capitalism. But the shift from colonialism to capitalism to green capitalism is just a semantic shift of labels, and the processes are actually the same. So beyond adaptation and mitigation, beyond loss and damage, we need a much more comprehensive understanding of climate change as something that's integrally related to colonial histories and ongoing forms of colonial extraction. Close to a century ago, Gandhi called on us to live differently, so that all of us could simply live. His understanding recognized the false promise of progress inherent in most social science, that is, that economic growth based on colonial extraction can never enable us all to live well. So the question that I think is still an open question and would want to leave you with is, what would it take for us to create a world in which all